All right, we left off last time in the 4th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, and we didn't finish the chapter, but I'm hoping to do that today and maybe get a little further than that even. As always, I'm going to continue putting this outline up here on the board so we can just keep track of where it is we are in the book. This is God making a sort of covenant treaty with Israel, and during this point we see God giving them the rules, the terms that they must live by, and if they want to stay in this special covenant relationship with God. We left off in chapter 4, beginning in verse 32, towards the end of Moses' first speech. It says, "Indeed, ask now concerning the former days which were before you, since the day that God created man on the earth, and inquire from one end of the heavens to the other, has anything been done like this great thing? Or has anything been heard like it? Has any people heard the voice of God speaking from the midst of the fire as you have heard it and survived? Or has a God tried to go to take for himself a nation from within another nation by trials, by signs and wonders, and by war, and by a mighty hand, and by an outstretched arm, and by great terrors, as the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? To you it was shown that you might know that the Lord, He is God. There is no other besides Him. Out of the heavens He let you hear His voice to discipline you. And on earth He let you see His great fire. And you heard His words from the midst of the fire. Because He loved your fathers, therefore He chose their descendants after them. And He personally brought you from Egypt by His great power, driving out from before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in and to give you their land for an inheritance, as it is today. Know therefore today, and take it to your heart, that the Lord, He is God in heaven above and on the earth below. There is no other. So you shall keep His statutes and His commandments, which I am giving you today, that it may go well with you and with your children after you, that you may live long on the land which the Lord your God is giving you for all time." Now, that's Deuteronomy 4, 32 through 40. What arguments are made here for God's uniqueness? What makes God so special? What arguments are made here for God's uniqueness? What does the text say? I'm sorry.
No one has ever done all this stuff for them.
Yeah, no one has ever done. Look at all the stuff God has done for you. No one has ever done this before. You know, He revealed Himself at Sinai and gave them a law. Had any other nation had that given to them? Had any other God done that with a nation? No. And this is these events of God giving special attention and care to a people. It's exemplified in Israel. But let me ask you another question. How are these statements more fully realized in Christ? What Christ has done for us, what has Christ done for us that's greater than what God has done here?
He died on the cross.
He died on the cross for us, yeah. And I mean, this is the special attention and care that God gives to this specific people, Israel, is matched and exceeded only by what Christ did when He came to die for our sins on the cross, for not just one nation, but for all nations. And so, I mean, we could easily just ask the question, what God has there been who came down and lived among His people, who died for the sins of those people at the hands of those people? And what God is there that took for Himself all nations by these signs and by wonders, as the Lord our God has done for us? In verses 35 and 39, it says that there is no God besides Yahweh, besides the Lord. He is one. There is no other besides Him. As a result, Israel has no business messing around with other idols or messing around with other gods or looking at other gods and participating in that. This is an exclusive relationship. There are no other gods in their lives. There are supposed to be no other gods. There's another element to all of this, though. It talks about God disciplining Israel. In verse 36, out of the heavens He lets you hear His voice to discipline you. What's so special about God disciplining a nation? Why would God discipline a nation?
Same reason parents discipline their children.
Why do parents discipline their children? Right. Because they love their children. What do I tell? That's what I tell John every time I have to discipline him, that we do this because we love you, because we want to see you become more than what you are. And that's what discipline is involved here. God did this in verse 37 because He loved your fathers, and therefore He chose your descendants after them. And He personally brought you up from Egypt by His great power. More than any other book in the law, more than any other book in the 5 books of the law of Moses, Deuteronomy emphasizes the love of God, the love that God has for His people, and the love that the people must have for God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength. God's uniqueness and His relationship with Israel demand His obedience. They must obey Him. They must obey Him not simply because He commands it, but because He deserves it. Any questions through verse 40? Now in verses 41 through 43, it says, Then Moses set apart 3 cities across the Jordan to the east, that a manslayer might flee there, who unintentionally slew his neighbor without having enmity toward him in time past, and by fleeing to one of these cities he might live. Bezer in the wilderness on the plateau for the Reubenites, Ramoth in Gilead for the Gadites, and Golan in Bashan for the Manassites. Now, why in the world are cities of refuge brought up here? We're reading this text about the great uniqueness of God, and then Moses set apart cities of refuge. Whoa, what's that got to do with anything? This is where the chapter division probably should have occurred, by the way, if you're going to put it somewhere.
Well, God gave that to people who had accidentally killed someone.
Okay, all right. Cities, that's right. Cities of refuge are for people who accidentally kill someone else to flee to. Jenna.
Is that maybe something about to do with how, like, he's asking what other God has given you a law like this one? And what other nations had a city of refuge or something like that?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. What other law makes these kinds of provisions? Admittedly, I haven't done a lot of research into other ancient Near Eastern law codes like Hammurabi and some of these others to find out if they had cities of refuge laws or not. I don't know what the rules were for that. But the law of the city of refuge is given in Deuteronomy 19 in verses 1 through 13 and in Deuteronomy 35 in verses 9 through 34. And basically, as Peggy said, it's a place of refuge where somebody unwittingly kills another person. Now, you can't just let that slide. Whenever blood is shed, it defiles the land. It defiles the ground on which it is shed. God gave a principle that's even older than the covenant of Sinai in Genesis 9, that when He said that whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood must be shed. That principle goes back even further than Moses. But a place of refuge and safety is given for somebody who did this by accident. And as long as he stays within that city, he is safe from the avenger of blood. And so the existence of these cities himself is a demonstration of God's compassion, a demonstration of His grace, His mercy, of His love that He's been so emphatic with the people about. The other reason this is in the text is, more mechanical. It's just kind of a transition, if you will. I have this outline on the board is one way you could outline Deuteronomy. The other way is Deuteronomy is actually composed of 3 speeches that Moses gives. And each speech has this long introductory thing at the beginning of it. In chapter 1 and verses 1 through 5, we saw the beginning of the first speech. This first speech ends at chapter 4, verse 40. 3 verses talk about the city of refuge, and then verses 44 through 49 give the introduction to what becomes the second speech that Moses gives. If I could do this over again, I would replace that 4 with the 4s with a 5 or something like that. But whatever, you can make these decisions and decide for yourself in your own study how you would outline it and all sorts of things. But it took a long time to get those numbers up there where they were big and bright so that everybody could see them and that they would show up on the camera. So I didn't really feel like going over it again. That said, if you keep reading, verse 44, now this is the law which Moses set before the sons of Israel. These are the testimonies and the statutes and the ordinances which Moses spoke to the sons of Israel when they came out from Egypt, across the Jordan, in the valley opposite Beth Peor, in the land of Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon, who Moses and the sons of Israel defeated when they came out from Egypt. They took possession of his land, and the land of Og, king of Bashan, the two kings of the Amorites, who were across the Jordan to the east, from Aroer, which is on the edge of the valley of Arnon, even as far as Mount Sion, that is Hermon, with all the Arabah across the Jordan to the east, even as far as the sea of the Arabah at the foot of the slopes of Pisgah. And that's a mouthful. You read all that at once. That's one sentence, and it's a mouthful, is what it is, in verses 44 through 49. But it echoes the preamble of chapter 1. This is the law which Moses set. These are the words which Moses spoke across the Jordan. Both passages mention the defeat of Sihon and Og. Both passages contain a bunch of geographical references to tell them where this happened. And then the speech starts. So that brings us to chapter 5. Are there any questions before we jump into it? And I'm notorious for talking about how much I don't like chapter divisions, and this is one where they probably could have placed it somewhere else than they did, but nevertheless, onward we shall press. Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the ordinances which I am speaking today in your hearing, that you may learn them and observe them carefully. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. The Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, with all those of us alive here today. The Lord spoke to you face to face at the mountain from the midst of the fire, while I was standing between the Lord and you at that time, to declare to you the word of the Lord, for you were afraid because of the fire and did not go up the mountain. He said, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, and on the third and the fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you, so that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Honor your father and your mother, as the Lord your God has commanded you, that your days may be prolonged, and that it may go well with you on the land which the Lord your God gives you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and you shall not desire your neighbor's house, his field, or his male servant, or his female servant, his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. All right, now, any of that sound familiar? Have we seen that before somewhere? Where did we see that before?
Exodus.
Yeah, we saw that in Exodus 20, whenever God spoke the Ten Commandments to them on Mount Sinai. And now, there's a kind of an introduction to the Ten Commandments in the first 5 verses. And Moses says something that I thought was rather interesting in verse 3. The Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, all those of us alive here today. Anything strike you as odd about that statement?
They're the ones receiving it. They're the ones receiving the promise of the people that are alive today.
Okay, right.
We're the ones receiving the promise made to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob.
Okay, all right. Jenna, what?
When he says fathers, do they mean like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or do they mean like the generation right before them that died?
It's a good question. The Lord did not make this commandment, but the Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, with all those of us alive here today. Now, when did God make the covenant with them originally? When did God speak these 10 commandments to them originally? How long ago is it? How long has it been?
About 40 years.
It's been about 40 years, hasn't it? You know, and that whole generation's died.
Yeah.
Their fathers. Well, wait a second, Moses. You said that he didn't make it with our fathers. He did make it with our fathers. Our fathers were there. They all died in the wilderness too. And most of the generation here was either very, very young or not even alive yet. And yet here, Moses is saying that the Lord did not make it with our fathers, but with all of us alive here today. Now, how do we explain that? That just seems a little odd.
I thought he could have possibly have meant the fathers, meaning people like Abraham and Isaac and Joseph and Jacob.
Well,
before Mount Sinai, maybe that way of explaining fathers before these people.
That's okay. Yeah, that's probably a way. I guess that's a way to explain it. I hadn't thought of that actually. That might be better than my explanation. I don't know yet, but my own explanation has been that his point is that God did not make this covenant just with our fathers. In other words, it's not limited to our ancestors. The covenant is not limited.
It was to be carried over that promise.
Yeah, it was to be carried over into another generation. And implicitly, these commandments don't just apply to the generation that receives the book of Deuteronomy that's standing on the plains of Moab hearing Moses speak, but the generations hundreds of years later also these commandments would apply to them as well. Whenever Josiah, they find the lost book of the law in Josiah and they open that up and they read it, well, the commandments are just as applicable then as they were back at Horeb and at Moab. And whenever Ezra and Nehemiah read the book of the law to the people, the commandments were just as applicable then. Implicitly then, it means that it stresses a generational continuity. God's law is something that stays with his people. Now, Moses spoke face to face with God. Even though Israel did not see any form, even though Moses could not really see God's face and live, it still says that Moses spoke face to face with God, and he stood between the people and God because of their fear. We'll come back to that in a little bit. Let me ask another question. The 10 Commandments we said were mentioned earlier in Exodus 20. And they're almost exactly the same, but there is one major difference. There's one commandment that is worded differently that's particularly noteworthy. Anybody catch what it was?
Great question, though. The question in the book.
Oh, the question in the book gives it away. What commandment is it? Well, now we find out who's reading the book. If you don't have a workbook, I apologize. I ran out. I need to make more copies at some point. Let's just say that for reference now. It's not that I'm ignoring you or neglecting you. It's that I don't have them. But those of you that have a workbook, since the 10 Commandments were already mentioned in Exodus 20, why are they repeated here and how do they serve as the the next question, excuse me. What commandment are you supposed to compare with Deuteronomy 5 that was in Exodus 20? The Sabbath commandment, yes. And what's different about it? What did Exodus 20 say? When Exodus 20 told them that they needed to keep the Sabbath, why did it say they should keep the Sabbath? That's what they were supposed to do. But why were they supposed to do it?
Remember God. Remember God.
Because God rested on the seventh day?
Because God rested on the seventh day. Exodus 20, let's go back and read it actually. It helps to go back and read the text. Exodus chapter 20, in verses 8 through 11, he says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you." Why? Verse 11, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." The reason in Exodus 20 that Israel was told to keep the Sabbath was because God created the world in 6 days and He rested on the seventh. And so Israel should also rest on the seventh day. Now you go to Deuteronomy 5. Did Deuteronomy mention the fact that God created the world in 6 days? No. It doesn't give that reason in Deuteronomy 5. What reason did it give? Dennis.
Remember what God did for them, bringing them up out of the land of Egypt.
Yes, verse 15, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. It's the same commandment. They're supposed to rest, they're supposed to keep it holy, they're not supposed to do laborious work. And, you know, the Mishnah is full of this really expanded tractate about how what laborious work constituted. But, you know, the Bible didn't see fit to elaborate on these things in that way. That was a Jewish tradition book that came out after the fact. But no laborious work, rest on the seventh day, that's all the same. But the reason is different. In Exodus 20, it's because God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. In Deuteronomy 5, it's because God led them out from the land of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Now, why would that be? Well, why would that change? What's the connection here? Is there any relationship between the two? Between God creating the world and Israel being led out of Egypt? Jenna?
Well, they're delivered from Egypt to go to a land where they can rest.
They're delivered from Egypt to go to a land where they can rest. That's a good point to bring out. Whenever Israel conquers the promised land, it says that the Lord gave them rest on every side. And rest is a big theme throughout the Bible. Whenever David defeats his enemies, this is the big contrast between David and Saul. Saul, it said, fought his enemies on every side all the days of his life. Fighting, fighting, fighting. But David, it says that the Lord gave David rest on every side. And it says the same thing about Solomon. That Solomon said that the Lord has given me rest on every side. Rest is more than just not doing any work. Rest is a state of being. It's a situation where there's peace and there's fellowship with God. It was something that was attained early on in the Garden of Eden, and then it was lost whenever mankind decided to do things differently than the way God wanted to do them. Whenever Noah was born, Lamech said, "This one will give us rest on every side." But Noah had his downfall as well. This one will give us rest from all our labors. It uses a different word for rest, but the same concept is there. Now here, God tells Israel they must rest on the Sabbath day to remind them of these things. There's a sense in which God leading Israel out of Egypt is itself a kind of creation. God created the world and He rested at the end of that day so that He could have fellowship with man. Here God creates a nation of Israel. He goes through all this effort to create this nation. And His goal is to give them rest. And one of the ways they commemorate that rest is by resting on the seventh day. Now, Jenna, yes?
So how does that, how do we have that now?
How do we have that now? I have to ask all the derailing questions. No, well, that's a good point to bring out, though. I think sometimes preachers will get into this thing where it's like, there's 10 commandments and they're not applicable today, but 9 of them are mentioned in the New Testament, so they are applicable, and we throw out the Sabbath, and we don't really talk about that very much. And I think it's a little bit to our detriment, because the Sabbath was never about what somebody's doing on Saturday. That's the first mistake we make, is we think, well, God just wanted to make people not work on Saturday. But the Sabbath was more than that. It was designed to commemorate God's creation of His people. And it was designed to commemorate their release from bondage. It's like when Jesus goes out and He performs miracles on the Sabbath day. He talks about the woman with the doubled over back that He runs into in the synagogue, and He heals her on the Sabbath day. And the synagogue leader complains, and he says, well, there's 6 other days in the week. You should come then and get healed. Why are you wasting our time with this on the Sabbath? And Jesus just tells him that this woman has been under bondage to Satan for so many years. Shouldn't she be released on the Sabbath day? Why? What more appropriate day? Because the Sabbath commemorates release from bondage. Well, Jesus heals on the Sabbath to fulfill the Sabbath. Jesus did not break the Sabbath. He fulfilled the Sabbath by healing on it. Now, in the same way, we can't talk about the Sabbath in the New Testament without talking about Hebrews chapter 4. There is a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And Hebrews 3 and 4 is kind of this exposition on Psalm 95, talking about all the meaning that it has for these people. And the psalm ends with the statement, "As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest," talking about the wilderness generation. But in chapter 4, it says, "Therefore let us fear, if, while a promise remains of entering his rest, any one of you may seem to have come short of it. For indeed we have had good news preached to us, just as they also. But the word they heard did not profit them, because it was not united in faith by those who heard. For we who have believed enter that rest. Just as he said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this passage, they shall not enter my rest. Therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience, he again fixes a certain day, today, saying through David after so long a time, just as had been said before, "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that." And there it's a reference to Joshua 21 where the Lord gave them the land and he gave them rest and all that. Verse 9, "So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works as God did from his. Therefore let us be diligent to enter that rest, so that no one will fall through following the same example of disobedience." What is the rest that the Hebrew author is speaking about here? Heaven. Yes. And, the ultimate consummation of our relationship with God, the resurrection of the dead, the return of Christ, the new heavens and the new earth, all of these things, it's a realization of that rest that God has been trying to have with mankind since the beginning, since the Garden of Eden. Now there's a sense in which that rest is realized right now via the church and the relationship we have with God. There's also a fuller sense in which that rest is still yet to come. So somebody asks me, well, what is the Sabbath? Well, if the Sabbath is about putting aside physical concerns to focus on our relationship with God and to remember all that he's done for us, I would say that every day is ultimately the Christian Sabbath in some sense of the word. Now, that's admittedly an inference I've drawn and not something that's explicitly stated in the text, but that seems to be the best way of understanding it that I'm aware of. God didn't just give Israel a day of rest. He also gave them a year of rest in Leviticus 25. And he gave them a year of Jubilee as well. And you think about it, what kind of trust does that require? In a society where a day's work is the difference between life and death, God tells them, one day of every week, I want you to put aside your work. And I want you to think about me, what I've done for you. 1 year once every 7 years, I want you to just, not labor in the fields, not sow your crops, not reap. Right? Not sowing and reaping? Well, for a year? Well, we're just asking to have all sorts of problems, right? But God promised that he would order his blessing for his people so that they would have double the year before, if they would just trust him. Now, the history in the Old Testament indicates that Israel did not do a very good job of keeping the Sabbath. Jeremiah 17 is pleading with them, saying, if you would just keep the Sabbath, God would not destroy your city. Well, lo and behold, God destroyed the city. So they didn't listen to that. They didn't keep the Sabbath. And when they finally come back from captivity, they reacted to it in such a way that created all this extra legalistic Pharisaical traditions. It's like, well, we're really going to take the Sabbath seriously now. And they add all these extra rules and these extra stipulations because they think they know better than God what works and what doesn't. And the end result is that the Sabbath has been so perverted that it is contradictory to its original purpose by the time of Jesus. A day of release from bondage has become a day of bondage, essentially. But anyhow, I didn't mean to go that far down that road and that tangent, but that's something to think about in the relationship of the Sabbath commandment. And that's really the main thing that's different from Exodus 20 is the rationale given for the Sabbath commandment. The others in there are pretty much all the same. Honor your father and mother. No other gods before me. That doesn't mean no other gods. But that doesn't mean that you can have other gods as long as they're in second or third place. That's not what God is saying. He's saying no other gods besides me. I am the only God, he says. And no idolatry, no building idols, no building graven images, which Israel did. I mean, Israel would build idols to represent Yahweh. We see that with the golden calf. We see that in 1 Kings 12. Jeroboam builds golden calves at Bethel and Dan, and he says, "This is Yahweh your God who brought you out of Egypt." And he was using that to say we're worshiping the same God, even though it's a golden calf. Which, and Jenna pointed. Yeah, Jenna keeps pointing this out to me. She's like, the cow, that's the best thing they could come up with to represent God? You couldn't think of something more glorious than that? Come on! I mean, really, what's wrong with you people? I ask. No taking Yahweh's name in vain, which really has more to do with oath-taking than anything. Swearing falsely by God's name profanes His name. And I do think we should be careful with our speech and the way we use the word God in our speech. I don't think that this particular commandment is specifically referring to exclamatory uses of the word God. You'll see this expression used throughout the Old Testament, as the Lord lives, I'm going to do this. Or, and that's somebody taking an oath. And whenever they take a foolish oath, they're taking God's name in vain. It's what you see Jephthah doing. It's what you see Saul doing. And that's what that is. You're lifting up God's name for no purpose at all, is what you're doing. So, and that's the basic point of that. I do think we need to be careful what we say, and that principle extends throughout the Bible and is even related to this command. But particularly when they heard taking God's name in vain, they didn't hear people saying OMG. They heard people saying people taking a foolish vow, basically, or a false vow even. Keeping the Sabbath, we talked about. Honor father and mother is the first commandment with a promise. Paul said that in Ephesians 6 and verses 2 and 3. And that promise, what promise is that? Maybe I'm just deaf. I can't hear, but... That it may go well with you in the land. And honoring father and mother, and there's more about this in the law. Rebellious children are addressed a little bit more in Deuteronomy. Do not murder. Murder has always been wrong from the beginning. That's why God said, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood must be shed. I do want to add this point, just in passing. So you'll sometimes find people putting forth the idea that, do not murder refers to any kind of killing whatsoever, so no capital punishment or anything like that. Just think about the dilemma that the executioner of Israel is in. It's time to... Somebody committed murder, and the law specifies the death penalty of that person. Well, I can't kill him. What am I going to do, right? Well, then that's clearly not the point that's being made here. God says, do not murder, and if you do murder, then you've got to pay with your life. And that's the point that he makes. Just like do not steal. Well, if you steal from somebody, you've got to pay it back. Usually you've got to pay it back double, sometimes 4 or 5 times, depending on what you stole. And the law talks quite a bit about that. Do not commit adultery. That's rooted in creation. Man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife. The two shall become one flesh. Since they're joined together by God, man has no business interfering with that or separating that. And the command also implicitly forbids divorce, since divorcing a spouse and marrying another constitutes adultery. Do not steal. One of the first commandments ever given and broken. Do not bear false witness against your neighbor. Probably more specifically addressing a court context. Although, really, you shouldn't lie at all, and that's the point. The God who is truth demands by His very nature that we not lie. Otherwise, we are not living up to the image He created us to be in. And finally, do not covet, which coveting is really what causes all the other problems on the list, isn't it? Why do people murder? Why do people steal? Why do people commit adultery? Why do people lie? Well, because they covet. They want something they don't have, and they're going to do anything they can to get it. And so the commandment comes full circle. In order to covet, one must essentially have another god besides Yahweh. Now they may not call it God, and they may not make a statue of it and bow down to it, but they've got something in their life that's more important to them than obedience to God. That's what coveting is, essentially. And so the first and the last commandments kind of come full circle with each other. Any comments or questions? We could talk a long time about the Ten Commandments, and that was me going through them in very, very brief fashion. Dennis?
One thing that strikes me, our society is so different today. If somebody was going to, if God was going to mandate a day off today, we'd say, yeah, sure, great. We're always looking for a day off as long as we can get paid.
Exactly.
But in this society, they're looking, a day of work is a day of eating.
Right.
They're providing for themselves. And the difference is so great that I've even heard the passage misapplied, in my opinion, misapplied, where it says 6 days you have to work. They're saying you need to make sure you're working 6 days out of the week.
You may work 6 days is more the idea.
Just a contrast.
Now, I mean, the Bible does say some things about idleness and laziness and other things like that. And Paul restates the principle, if a man's not willing to work, he's not going to eat either. And his point there is, in the context of Thessalonians, is talking more about their patronage society and their sense of entitlement that they had, where instead of working with their hands, which was considered to be a thing for second-class citizens in Greco-Roman culture, they would be the benefactors of all their patrons, and people would just give them money because of that patron-client relationship. And Paul says, no, you work with your hands. Everybody is to work. He says that in both Thessalonian letters, really. And the point is not like some people put forth that, well, people are just quitting their jobs because they thought Jesus was coming back any day. Because that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's no real logical connection between those two things. The point is that these people are living in a society of entitlement. And Paul says, don't live that way. But Dennis is right. When God said 6 days you shall work, but the seventh day you shall rest, the point isn't you have to work 6 days. The point is that you have to rest on the seventh day, and you have to trust that God can provide for you. You cannot accomplish it with your own effort. You cannot win with your own brute force exerted upon these crops. Ultimately, God's the one that makes them grow, and you can't do lickety-split about that. It's just a fact. Well, we're out of time, and we did not finish chapter 5, but we'll do that next time and hopefully get a little bit into chapter 6. And that's it.